Within the crumbling remnants of Terres Majoris, 17 billion souls collectively held their breath, awaiting the grim decree that would determine their value in the unforgiving gaze of the Emperor's angels. When salvation finally descended, manifest in the armored forms of Space Marines, it was accompanied not by grace, but by cold, impartial calculations. These algorithms would meticulously sift through the vast populace, dictating with chilling precision who among the countless masses was deemed worthy of life, and who would be sacrificed upon the brutal altar of the mathematics of war. The sprawling city had once known beauty, a distant memory from before the relentless tides of war engulfed it, before its once azure skies bled into the color of dried blood, and the very air became a metallic, acrid cocktail of ash and despair. This desolation preceded the arrival of the Tyrannid advance fleet, whose chittering masses had commenced their inexorable, continent-spanning march, consuming all in their wake like an unstoppable, living tide composed of ravenous teeth and insatiable hunger. 17 separate astropathic pleas for aid had been desperately broadcast by the planetary governor, each more frantic than the last. Each urgent transmission resonated with the collective agony of worlds, an electromagnetic scream of despair hurled across the vast, indifferent void. The eventual response materialized as 3 Thunderhawk gunships, their hulls adorned with the distinctive crimson and bone heraldry of the Angels Sanguinary, a grim omen for those who knew their reputation. 17 billion souls, a populace whose sheer numbers defied human comprehension, pressed against grimy windows, crammed onto precarious rooftops, and spilled into the choked streets. All watched in silent awe as the formidable aircraft descended through the smoke-laden atmosphere, appearing less like machines and more like grim, falling stars. Children pointed and laughed, their innocent minds convinced that true salvation had finally arrived. Their parents, however, wept with a different kind of relief, clinging to the desperate hope that the Emperor's angels of death would unequivocally deliver them from the Xenos nightmare, clawing at their very walls. And they were right, of course, about the salvation. Yet, they possessed no inkling of its true horrific cost. Captain Dante Vex of the Angels Sanguinary's 3rd Company stood a silent sentinel atop the highest spire of the planetary governor's palace, his augmented eyes meticulously surveying the sprawling, dying metropolis below. Through the arcane mechanics of his autosenses, he effortlessly processed torrents of information at speeds that would incinerate mortal minds in mere seconds. Population density calculations cascaded across his retinal display like a relentless digital rain. Resource allocation algorithms hummed softly in his ear, a constant low thrum. Tactical overlays materialized, painting the city in stark shades of strategic value, precisely delineating industrial sectors, vital transportation hubs, fortified military installations, and sprawling civilian population centers with an almost inhuman, cold mathematical precision. The captain's hyper-acute hearing detected the first faint whisper of the approaching horde long before any unaugmented ear could register it. It was a low, resonant thrumming, seemingly emanating from the very earth itself, like the colossal heartbeat of some vast, primordial, and terrible god. This insidious vibration traveled up through the city's ancient foundations, through layers of rockcrete and plastol, resonating deep within the bones of every living soul still trapped within its besieged borders. Those few mortals with the keenest, most sensitive perceptions felt it first as a nascent unease, a deep restlessness, a subtle yet pervasive wrongness that compelled them to check their door locks twice and hold their children a little closer, instinctively sensing an unseen threat. Captain Vex knew, with absolute certainty, the dreadful meaning of that sound. He had heard its chilling cadence before, on Mordax Prime, on Helios II, and on dozens of other ill-fated worlds where the Great Devourer had made its ravenous call with an endless, all-consuming appetite. The sound was, in truth, the collective, earth-shaking movement of trillions of organisms, each a living weapon honed by eons of brutal evolution and relentless warfare, all utterly unified in their singular, terrifying purpose of utter consumption. The Tyranids were, by his calculations, perhaps 8 hours away from the city's outer perimeter, possibly even less. The captain activated his VoxLink, and his voice, imbued with the weight of absolute authority, cut across the tactical network. Begin the assessment protocol. All squads report readiness for immediate implementation of contingency measures. Far below, amidst the labyrinthine, crowded streets and crumbling tenement blocks, the citizens of Terres Majoris continued their frantic, desperate preparations. This grim routine had persisted for weeks, ever since the first terrified refugees began streaming in from the outlying settlements, bringing with them harrowing tales of horror that defied all belief. Improvised barricades, cobbled together from shattered furniture and twisted scrap metal, now choked major thoroughfares. Civilian defense forces, hastily assembled from remnants of the Planetary Defense Force and raw volunteer militias, manned rudimentary checkpoints, wielding laser guns that most barely knew how to operate. Food distribution centers labored around the clock, a tireless effort to stretch dwindling supplies amongst an ever-swelling population of displaced persons. In the hastily erected refugee camps that now scarred the city's once verdant parks and grand squares, families huddled together around flickering fires built from broken debris, sharing whispered stories, fervent prayers, and whatever meager rations they could manage to obtain. Children played grim games of war in the shifting shadows between tents, innocently mimicking the movements they had observed from real soldiers, utterly unaware that their seemingly harmless play was, in fact, an unwitting preparation for a reality infinitely more terrible than any game could ever hope to capture. The elderly sat in quiet, stoic circles, their weathered faces etched with the profound weariness that only comes from having endured too many disasters, suffered too many losses, and witnessed too many moments when their world seemed perpetually poised on the brink of absolute annihilation. None of them, however, possessed any true comprehension of the grim proceedings unfolding within the sealed, fortified chambers of the planetary governor's palace, where Captain Vex and his battle brothers had established their austere command center. None could have fathomed the intricate, soul-numbing calculations being performed, the countless variables being relentlessly weighed, nor the cold, unforgiving equations that would soon determine their very fates with an unfeeling, mathematical precision. The assessment protocol itself was an ancient doctrine, forged over centuries of brutal, unceasing warfare, meticulously refined through bitter experience and countless tactical simulations. It represented a systematic, albeit ruthless, method for determining the optimal allocation of severely limited resources when confronted by overwhelming, insurmountable odds. It was ultimately a grim calculus designed to maximize the strategic value preserved when total, indiscriminate preservation was an absolute impossibility. Amongst the Space Marines, in their private, stoic discussions, it bore many names: triage on a planetary scale, the Emperor's mathematics, the calculation of necessity. The civilians, however, would come to know it by far simpler, more desperate names, though they would not learn them until it was far, far too late to matter. Brother Sergeant Maximus, his visage impassive, reviewed the torrents of data feeds streaming across his helmet display as his tactical squad meticulously established observation posts throughout the city's congested middle sectors. Through his enhanced vision, he perceived the stark, animalistic fear in every mortal face. Through his augmented olfactory systems, he could almost taste it in the primal scent of sweat and stress pheromones that permeated the recycled stale air. The mortals moved with the jerky, unpredictable patterns of prey animals, instinctively sensing the imminent approach of predators. Their surging stress hormones painted bright, unmistakable chemical signatures that his enhanced olfactory systems could detect and analyze from hundreds of meters away. Population analysis subroutines ceaselessly compiled demographics in real time, sorting the 17 billion souls into chilling categories that would have frozen their very blood had they comprehended the cold, ruthless criteria being applied. Age, health status, skill sets, genetic markers, psychological profiles, and even the calculated likelihood of survival under extreme duress. Each individual became a mere data point within a vast, unforgiving, algorithmic matrix. Their entire, complex lives were reduced to stark statistical probabilities and impersonal resource allocation coefficients. The sergeant's Vox unit crackled with a steady stream of reports from observation teams scattered across the vast urban sprawl. Sector 77 reporting optimal defensive positioning. Structural integrity rated at 82%. Population density within acceptable parameters. Another voice chimed in. Industrial Zone 12 maintaining full operational capacity. Workforce efficiency rating above baseline standards. A third, more urgent report. Residential Block 49 shows signs of civil unrest. Recommend immediate intervention if preservation protocols are activated. Each successive report added another chilling layer to the rapidly growing tactical picture. Another crucial piece of data in the vast, grim puzzle that Captain Vex and his command staff were methodically assembling. The entire city was being dissected, relentlessly analyzed, and meticulously cataloged with the same methodical, unfeeling precision that the Astartes applied to every single aspect of their brutal warfare. Every street was meticulously mapped, instantly becoming a potential kill zone or a vital defensive position. Every building was ruthlessly evaluated for its strategic worth, its structural integrity, its capacity to shelter valuable personnel or precious resources. And every single person was cold-bloodedly assessed for their potential contribution to the war effort, their calculated likelihood of survival, and ultimately their predetermined place in the intricate, unforgiving hierarchy of necessity that governed all tactical decision-making. In the palace's deepest, most secured sublevels, Tech Marine Kareth interfaced directly with the city's labyrinthine central cogitation systems. His numerous mechanical appendages plugged into glowing data ports with the smooth, practiced efficiency of centuries of devotion. His augmented consciousness merged seamlessly with the revered machine spirits of the urban infrastructure, granting him access to an unfathomable wealth of information that no mortal administrator could have compiled in a dozen lifetimes. Power grid schematics flowed through his expanded awareness like shimmering rivers of light. Water distribution networks instantly mapped themselves in intricate, three-dimensional holographic displays. Vast transportation systems, complex communication arrays, sprawling manufacturing facilities, all of it became an intrinsic, comprehensible part of his augmented perception. The Tech Marine's augmented vocal cords produced the distinctive, chittering binary cant as he communed with the machine spirits, requesting status reports and system diagnostics with the solemn reverence due to such ancient and noble artificial intelligences. The city's cogitators responded with cascading streams of data, a deluge that would have instantly overwhelmed any merely human consciousness, yet which Kareth processed with the casual, almost reflexive ease of breathing. Population registers, intricate resource inventories, precise production schedules, meticulous maintenance logs, comprehensive criminal records, exhaustive medical databases, detailed educational transcripts, complete military service histories, genetic screening results, psychological evaluation profiles. Every single citizen of Tersus Majoris existed within these omnipresent data streams, their lives meticulously cataloged in exhaustive detail by the ubiquitous surveillance apparatus that was the inevitable, grim companion of civilized existence within the Imperium. The Tech Marine possessed the power to access birth certificates and death records, tax assessments and loyalty ratings, medical treatments and disciplinary actions, career achievements, and social connections. He could trace bloodlines back through generations, analyze genetic predispositions for disease and psychological instability, and calculate precise productivity metrics and resource consumption patterns. All of this critical information flowed ceaselessly back to Captain Vex, who stood utterly motionless in the palace's highest chamber, his superhuman mind processing the torrents of tactical data with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a purpose-built war machine. The approaching Tyrannid horde was now less than 6 hours away, so close that his enhanced hearing could distinctly differentiate individual creature types within the collective, ominous chittering. Gaunts, numbering in the millions, their chitinous claws scraping against rockcrete as they swarmed over every obstacle in their path. The heavier, rhythmic tread of Tyrannid warriors, their bioweapons already priming for combat. And the truly distinctive, earth-shaking sound of massive Carnifex biotitans, each monstrous footfall causing minor seismic tremors that registered ominously on the palace's advanced security sensors. The captain's battle brothers awaited his commands with the patient, unyielding discipline that was their hallowed birthright. They had witnessed him perform similar, grim calculations on countless other worlds, observed the terrible mathematics of survival enacted in torrents of blood and cleansing fire. They trusted his judgment implicitly, understanding that whatever decision he reached would be rooted in centuries of tactical experience and the cold, unyielding logic of military necessity. Yet trust and true understanding were distinct entities entirely. Even among the Astartes, a rare few struggled with the profound implications of the assessment protocol, their enhanced intellects rebelling against the stark utilitarian calculus that so callously reduced human lives to mere statistical variables. These few Space Marines learned to ruthlessly suppress such doubts, to discipline their thoughts with the same relentless rigor they applied to their superhuman bodies, to accept that the greater good of the Imperium sometimes demanded sacrifices that no individual conscience could easily or truly bear. Captain Vex, however, harbored no such internal conflict. His indoctrination was absolute, his conditioning complete. He understood with crystalline clarity that sentiment was the insidious enemy of efficiency, that emotional attachments could fatally compromise the precise, clear thinking necessary for optimal tactical decisions. The 17 billion souls arrayed below were not people to him, not in any sense that would have been recognizable to their own limited understanding. They were resources, mere variables in a complex, vital equation, assets to be meticulously preserved or ruthlessly expended according to the dictates of strategic necessity. The initial phase of the assessment protocol involved determining the city's absolute maximum defensible population. This was not a simplistic calculation of how many people could physically be crammed within the urban perimeter, but rather a complex analysis of how many could be realistically sustained, adequately protected, and effectively utilized under prolonged siege conditions. Crucial factors like food and water reserves, essential medical supplies, ammunition stocks, and vital fuel reserves all had to be meticulously balanced against the projected duration of the conflict and the expected, often devastating, casualty rates among both civilian and military personnel. Techmarine Kareth's comprehensive analysis indicated that the city's dwindling resources could, at best, sustain approximately 4 billion people for the estimated 6-month duration of the impending siege. This grim projection assumed strict adherence to standard rationing protocols and an acceptable rate of mortality from disease and malnutrition. Furthermore, this figure predicated optimal distribution efficiency, complete and unquestioning civilian cooperation with military directives, and crucially, no significant disruption to the existing infrastructure during the course of the brutal conflict. The mathematical reality was stark, unyielding, and utterly unforgiving. 17 billion souls currently sheltered within the city's beleaguered borders. 4 billion could, potentially, be sustained through the siege. The chilling difference represented 13 billion people whose continued existence would constitute an intolerable drain on resources that could otherwise be allocated to preserve those deemed more strategically valuable. Captain Vex reviewed this chilling analysis with the same detached clinical professionalism he would have applied to an ammunition inventory report or an equipment maintenance schedule. The numbers, to him, were simply unvarnished facts, cold data points to be dispassionately incorporated into his tactical planning. The immeasurable human cost, the individual tragedies, the families irrevocably torn apart and dreams utterly destroyed. These were mere abstractions that existed entirely outside the scope of his calculations. They were emotional considerations, and emotion, in the pure, unadulterated logic of warfare, had no place. The second phase meticulously involved identifying preservation priorities. It was a brutal truth, long acknowledged by the Imperium's rigid hierarchical social structure, that not all civilians possessed equal strategic value. The assessment protocol formally codified these grim distinctions into an ironclad ranking system designed to be applied consistently across myriad combat scenarios and diverse population groups. At the apex of this hierarchy were individuals whose skills and knowledge were deemed absolutely irreplaceable or critically important to the war effort. This included tech priests and senior engineers, possessing intimate understanding of vital infrastructure systems, experienced military officers, and non-commissioned personnel capable of providing crucial leadership for nascent civilian defense forces. Medical professionals skilled in treating both common ailments and exotic combat injuries, and highly skilled manufacturing workers who could adapt production lines to relentlessly support the military campaign. These paramount individuals would receive maximum protection and preferential resource allocation, their very survival prioritized above all other considerations. They would be immediately relocated to the most secure subterranean facilities within the city, provided with the best available equipment and supplies, and assigned personal protection details if the situation demanded it. Their immediate families would also receive an elevated status, serving both as a psychological incentive for the critical personnel's continued cooperation and as a practical measure for maintaining morale among those vital few. The subsequent tier encompassed individuals whose skills were valuable, yet not utterly irreplaceable. This included administrative personnel capable of managing complex logistics operations, educators who could maintain basic training programs for nascent civilian auxiliaries, communications specialists proficient in operating and maintaining vital vox equipment under combat conditions, and skilled laborers whose expertise could be adapted to urgent military manufacturing requirements. These individuals would receive standard protection and resource allocation, their essential needs met only to the extent that dwindling supplies allowed, and never at the cost of compromising the security or resources of higher priority individuals. They would be housed in designated sectors, possessing adequate defenses, provided with basic equipment and training for rudimentary self-defense, and assigned specific, predetermined roles within the overall defensive plan. Beneath these tiers came the vast general population, ruthlessly sorted into subcategories based on age, health, and potential military utility. Young adults in prime physical condition could be conscripted into auxiliary forces or assigned to arduous manual labor details. Older citizens possessing specialized knowledge might serve in advisory or training roles. Children, while representing potential future assets for the Imperium, also constituted immediate resource drains that had to be coldly weighed against more pressing military necessities. At the absolute bottom of this chilling hierarchy were those deemed to possess minimal strategic value. This encompassed the elderly and infirm who could not meaningfully contribute to the war effort. Individuals with criminal records or deeply questionable loyalty ratings, and those whose psychological profiles indicated poor performance under stress or a high likelihood of panic-induced disruptive behavior. The assessment protocol was unequivocally clear about the grim fate of this final category. In situations where resources were utterly insufficient to sustain the entire population, these individuals would be summarily classified as expendable. Their meager rations would be ruthlessly redirected to higher priority groups. Their living spaces would be swiftly reallocated to more valuable personnel. They would be explicitly excluded from any evacuation procedures should a retreat become necessary. In the most stark and practical terms, they would simply be left to die. Brother Sergeant Maximus observed the ongoing preparations with the detached, analytical interest of a seasoned professional evaluating a complex operational scenario. His tactical squad had been specifically assigned to meticulously oversee the implementation of the preservation protocols within the city's bustling middle sectors, precisely where the bulk of the skilled worker population resided. The mortals below moved with an increasing, palpable desperation as fragmented rumors began to spread like wildfire through the choked, crowded streets, though none of them truly grasped the full, horrific implications of what was unfolding. The first overt signs emerged when administrative personnel began conducting new, intrusive population surveys, moving door to door with data slates, and conducting detailed, probing interviews about occupations, skill sets, family connections, and health status. These questions seemed reasonable enough at first, precisely the kind of comprehensive data collection expected during a military emergency when dwindling resources needed to be allocated efficiently and crucial personnel assignments made based on proven capability. But as the tense hours relentlessly passed, chilling patterns began to starkly emerge, filling the few perceptive observers with a cold, creeping, and utterly profound dread. Certain individuals conspicuously received small, metallic tokens that granted them exclusive access to special distribution centers where higher quality rations were available. Others found themselves arbitrarily assigned to specific residential blocks that, by strange coincidence, happened to be located near the most heavily fortified sections of the city's formidable defensive perimeter. Families were ruthlessly split apart as some members received drastically different priority classifications than others. Children were agonizingly separated from their parents, their fate determined by cold age and health assessments that no one would or could explain. The civilian population's initial, fervent gratitude toward their Space Marine protectors began to curdle, twisting into something rapidly approaching abject fear as they slowly, horrifyingly realized that their promised salvation had arrived bearing conditions they had never been asked to accept, nor even permitted to comprehend. Whispered, terrified conversations in darkened alleyways spoke of neighbors who had been quietly, mysteriously relocated during the dead of night, of entire residential blocks suddenly declared off-limits to all but essential personnel, of distribution centers that had abruptly ceased serving anyone lacking the proper, elusive authorization tokens. Those fortunate few with the most valuable skills found themselves living in relative, albeit precarious, comfort. Their families afforded a measure of protection, and their needs met with an almost chilling efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. But for every single person whose status improved, there seemed to be dozens, even hundreds, whose circumstances grew steadily, terrifyingly worse as precious resources were ruthlessly redistributed. According to cold priorities they could neither understand nor possess any power to influence. Captain Vex meticulously monitored these evolving developments through the precise, dispassionate reports of his subordinates, noting with a grim professional satisfaction that the implementation was proceeding strictly according to established protocols. There had been some minor, isolated incidents of civil unrest, swiftly and decisively suppressed by the implacable presence of armed Space Marines, but nothing that genuinely threatened the overall stability of the complex operation. The civilian population, with a chilling, almost instinctive, resigned pragmatism, was adapting to their new, brutal circumstances. A pragmatism that centuries of relentless imperial rule had inexorably bred into the very core of the species. The Tyranid advanced scouts were now less than 4 hours from the city's outer perimeter. Through precise, long-range OpSpec scans, the Space Marines could observe the leading edge of the Horde as it flowed relentlessly across the ravaged landscape like a monstrous living flood, consuming everything in its path with an unspeakably methodical thoroughness. The sight was both horrifyingly magnificent and utterly terrible, a chilling demonstration of evolutionary perfection, ruthlessly directed toward the singular, terrible purpose of consumption and unbridled growth. Individual creatures were utterly impossible to distinguish within the colossal, seething mass, but thermal imaging revealed the general, terrifying composition of the approaching force. Countless termagants and hormagaunts formed the primary chitinous assault wave, their numbers so staggeringly vast that they appeared as a single, undulating carpet of ravenous movement across the planetary surface. Behind them lumbered the heavier bioforms, tyrannid warriors and monstrous carnifexes, whose grim role would be to exploit any breaches in the defensive lines and provide crucial synapse control for the smaller, less intelligent organisms. The sky above the horde writhed with countless flying creatures, screeching gargoyles and predatory harpies that would provide terrifying aerial reconnaissance and unleash targeted strikes against critical defensive positions. In the far distance, barely discernible even to enhanced Astartes optics, the massive titanic silhouettes of biotitans dominated the horizon like walking mountains of living weaponry. This was an enemy force capable of conquering entire star systems, a horrifying concentration of biomass and military capability that represented the accumulated, indiscriminate consumption of dozens of worlds. Against such truly overwhelming, incomprehensible odds, the survival of even a mere fraction of Tursus Majoris's population would constitute a strategic victory of monumental magnitude. Captain Vex initiated the final, most brutal phase of the assessment protocol, the actual, irreversible implementation of preservation measures. Throughout the beleaguered city, carefully prepared announcements began broadcasting over the public address systems, their tone unnervingly calm and authoritative as they outlined new emergency procedures that all citizens were now stringently required to follow for their own purported safety and the security of the overarching defensive effort. Certain residential areas, they announced, were being temporarily evacuated to allow for the urgent construction of additional defensive positions. The residents, it was promised, would be relocated to more secure facilities in other unspecified parts of the city. Yet, the announcement has remained deliberately vague about the precise location of these facilities, or when the relocated individuals might ever expect to return to their homes, or if those homes would even remain standing. Food and water distribution, it was declared, was being centralized to ensure a more efficient allocation of precious resources during the siege. Citizens would now be required to report to designated centers at specific times, bringing with them proper identification and the newly issued authorization tokens to receive their assigned meager rations. Those without proper documentation would need to report to ominous processing centers where their status could be verified and appropriate arrangements made, a chilling euphemism for their impending fate. All civilians possessing critical skills were stringently required to report immediately to mobilization centers where they would receive specialized training and equipment for their vital roles in the defensive effort. Their immediate families, the announcements assured, would be provided with appropriate accommodations and protection while they fulfilled their arduous duties to the Emperor and the Imperium. The language employed was bureaucratic and superficially reassuring, meticulously crafted to promote compliance rather than outright panic. But beneath the careful anodyne phrasing lay the cold, unyielding steel framework of the assessment protocol. The ruthless, systematic sorting of human lives into stark, preordained categories of value and utter expendability. Those few who could read between the lines, who possessed the grim understanding of terms like temporary evacuation and appropriate arrangements, began to make their own desperate, clandestine preparations. Some, in their terror, attempted to flee the doomed city entirely, loading whatever meager possessions they could carry into hastily prepared ground vehicles and desperately attempting to escape through the outer perimeter before the Tyranids arrived. These desperate attempts were quietly, efficiently intercepted by Space Marine patrols. The would-be refugees were sternly turned back with ostensibly reassuring explanations about the grave dangers of traveling through areas that might already be compromised by Xenos infiltrators. The true reason, however, was far simpler and infinitely colder. The assessment protocol absolutely required accurate population counts and precise resource allocation calculations, vital objectives that would be irrevocably compromised if significant numbers of people were permitted to leave the designated controlled area. Others attempted to surreptitiously improve their priority status through various forms of deception or desperate bribery, falsely claiming skills they did not possess, or attempting to purchase higher-tier authorization tokens from corrupt, desperate officials. These efforts were, for the most part, entirely futile, as the Space Marines' assessment methods were far more sophisticated, meticulous, and unyielding than the desperate civilians could possibly realize. Biometric scans, intricate genetic analysis, and penetrating psychological evaluations could unflinchingly reveal the unvarnished truth about any individual within mere minutes, rendering it utterly impossible to sustain false claims about capability or strategic value. A desperate few, their minds finally piercing the veil of official rhetoric, recognized the true horrific nature of what was happening and attempted to organize nascent resistance movements, gathering small groups of like-minded individuals who were utterly unwilling to accept their assigned ignominious fate within the preservation hierarchy. These futile efforts were detected and neutralized with the same clinical, unfeeling efficiency that the Astartes applied to all forms of tactical problem-solving. The organizers simply vanished during the dead of night, their followers scattered and utterly demoralized by the chilling demonstration of their protectors' absolute authority. Brother Sergeant Maximus personally spearheaded one such intervention, his tactical squad moving through the darkened streets with the silent, deadly precision of apex predators stalking their unsuspecting prey. Their target was a former PDF colonel, a disruptive figure who had been actively attempting to rally civilian resistance within the industrial sectors. He was spreading dangerous, seditious ideas, questioning the Space Marines' true intentions, and openly encouraging others to defy the vital preservation protocols. The operation itself concluded swiftly within mere minutes. The colonel was extracted from his hiding place with brutal efficiency and immediately transported to a secure facility for rigorous interrogation and subsequent processing. His remaining followers were left with undeniable, chilling evidence of their utter powerlessness in the face of Astartes' capabilities. A stark message designed to spread rapidly throughout the civilian population and effectively discourage any similar attempts at organized resistance. The sergeant felt no particular emotion regarding the operation. Neither satisfaction nor regret registered within his enhanced psyche. It was simply a cold, tactical necessity, a problem demanding a swift solution to maintain the overall effectiveness of the critical preservation effort. While the colonel possessed potentially valuable military experience, his steadfast refusal to accept proper authority rendered him a far greater danger than any potential asset. His swift removal would, in fact, enhance the long-term stability of the civilian population by permanently eliminating a significant source of disruptive influence. As the final agonizing hours before the Tyranid assault relentlessly ticked away, the true, horrifying scope of the assessment protocol began to reveal itself with chilling clarity. Throughout the beleaguered city, millions of unsuspecting people found themselves subtly, yet inexorably, herded into specific, predetermined areas. Their very movement was meticulously controlled through a calculated combination of incentives, stringent restrictions, and, when necessary, direct, forceful intervention. Citizens, with the highest priority ratings, were carefully gathered into the most defensible sections of the urban core, protected by the heaviest fortifications and the largest concentrations of Space Marine personnel. Conversely, lower priority individuals found themselves arbitrarily assigned to the outer sectors, areas explicitly designated to serve as perilous buffer zones during the initial, brutal assault phases. They were grudgingly provided with basic laser guns and given only minimal tactical training. They were told their critical role was to delay and disrupt the Xenos' advance, buying precious time while the main defensive positions were meticulously prepared for the rigors of prolonged siege warfare. The grim reality, which none of them could fully grasp, was that they were being deliberately positioned to absorb the devastating first wave of Tyranid attacks, their inevitable sacrifice buying crucial time for the preservation of more strategically valuable assets. The lowest priority groups of all were directed toward facilities that had been cynically designated as temporary shelters, massive, imposing structures located in the city's outermost districts, designed to house hundreds of thousands of people in cramped, yet theoretically safe conditions. These so-called shelters were equipped with only basic life support systems and minimal supplies, barely enough to sustain their occupants for perhaps a few desperate days under optimal conditions. Crucially, however, these shelters utterly lacked adequate defensive measures, reliable communication systems, or any viable means of evacuation should the Tyranid assault prove devastatingly successful in those vulnerable sectors. They were, in chilling essence, nothing more than containment facilities, specifically designed to concentrate vast, expendable population groups in areas where their inevitable loss would not, under any circumstances, compromise the overall defensive effort. Captain Vex surveyed the final deployment statistics with a profound sense of professional satisfaction. The ruthless preservation protocols had been implemented with exceptional, almost surgical, efficiency. The immense population of Tertius Majorus, numbering 17 billion souls, had been meticulously sorted and precisely positioned according to their assessed strategic value, causing minimal disruption to the overarching defensive preparations. Resource allocation had been ruthlessly optimized. Critical defensive positions had been manned by the most capable available personnel, and all potential sources of civilian unrest had been effectively neutralized or contained. The chilling mathematics of survival had been calculated with absolute precision. Every variable had been meticulously weighted and balanced to maximize the probability of preserving the most strategically valuable elements of the population above all else. It was, in his estimation, a grim masterpiece of military planning, a stark demonstration of the cold, unyielding logic that permitted the Imperium to endure in a galaxy perpetually filled with existential threats. The human cost, of course, was undeniably immense. A staggering 13 billion people had been effectively condemned to certain death, their fates irrevocably sealed by cold algorithms that reduced their entire lives, their hopes and dreams, to mere statistical probabilities and resource allocation coefficients. Families had been cruelly torn apart, entire communities obliterated, and countless individual dreams, hopes, and human dignities had been brutally sacrificed on the unyielding altar of tactical necessity. Yet, these were considerations that existed entirely outside the practical scope of military planning. The Space Marines were not social workers, nor were they humanitarian aid coordinators. They were, first and foremost, weapons of war, meticulously designed and rigorously trained for the singular, uncompromising purpose of achieving absolute victory against the myriad enemies of mankind. If that ultimate victory required agonizing choices and immense painful sacrifices, then those choices would be made without a flicker of hesitation or a shadow of regret. The first horrifying tyrannid organisms finally reached the city's outer perimeter, just as the agonizing final phase of civilian deployment was reluctantly completing. Scout creatures, small, swift, and utterly alien, probed the desperate defensive positions with the patient, calculating intelligence of apex predators, testing their prey's strength and resolve. They were met by concentrated las fire from the outer defense lines, manned by civilians who had been ruthlessly classified as expendable, yet who fought with the desperate, almost suicidal courage of those who understood that retreat was simply not an option. Behind these probing scout forces, the main overwhelming assault was inexorably massing. It was a monstrous tide of living weapons, poised to test every single aspect of the ruthless preservation protocols in the unforgiving crucible of actual, brutal combat. The chilling assessment had been completed, the grim calculations made, and the fates of billions had been irrevocably determined by the cold, impartial mathematics of warfare. Now, it would be grimly revealed whether the Emperor's sanguinary angels had chosen correctly, whether their brutal, dispassionate efficiency in sorting the worthy from the expendable would prove truly sufficient to preserve anything valuable from the coming storm of alien teeth, razor claws, and endless, ravenous hunger. Deep within the most secure bunker, cocooned amidst the highest priority civilians and protected by the most sophisticated defensive systems the Imperium could possibly provide, Captain Vex meticulously monitored the tactical displays with the patient, unwavering attention of a master craftsman observing the unfolding of his grand, grim work. The cataclysmic battle for Tertius Majoris was poised to begin, and he knew that every death, every agonizing sacrifice, every moment of heroism or cowardice would serve as invaluable data points for future, even colder, calculations. The assessment protocol itself would be relentlessly refined based on these harrowing results, its brutal algorithms updated and improved for the next doomed world, the next impossible, agonizing choice. The next time the Space Marines would be forced to dispassionately decide who among the countless masses of humanity truly deserved the fleeting chance to survive another day. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there was never, ever enough salvation to go around, and someone, somewhere, would always have to make the terrible calculations that determined who lived and who died in the Emperor's name. The cacophony of gunfire, a harsh prelude to the coming storm, echoed violently across the ravaged city as the outer defense lines finally engaged the ravenous first wave of tyrannid assault troops. In the ominous distance, the distinctive thunderous roar of bolter weapons mingled with the inhuman, blood-curdling screaming of dying Xenos, forging a terrifying symphony of violence that was destined to continue for days, perhaps even weeks, until one side or the other achieved total, brutal victory. 17 billion souls had waited, with bated breath and rising dread, to discover their ultimate worth in the cold, impassive eyes of the Emperor's angels. Now, as the battle began in earnest, they would finally learn whether the Space Marines' ruthless calculations had indeed been sufficient to preserve anything valuable from the Great Devourer's endless, insatiable appetite. The merciless assessment was now complete. The true trial by fire had grimly begun. Brother Sergeant Maximus stood atop a heavily reinforced observation post in Sector 12, his helmet's enhanced optics relaying the grim spectacle as the first wave of ravenous hormagaunts crashed against the outer defensive perimeter like a devastating tide of living razors. The civilian defenders, barely equipped with laser guns and minimal tactical training, were manning those desperate positions. Yet nothing could have truly prepared them for the horrifying reality of facing the Great Devourer's monstrous children in open combat. Through his Vox link, he could hear their raw, panicked voices, a desperate cacophony of pleas for support, for ammunition, for medical assistance, anything that might conceivably help them hold their doomed, assigned positions for a few more precious minutes. Predictably, many of these requests were coldly denied based on stringent resource allocation priorities. Others were fulfilled with only the bare minimum necessary supplies, just enough to keep the defensive line nominally functional without compromising more strategically important operations elsewhere in the sprawling city. The sergeant's enhanced bionic hearing could distinguish individual voices even within the maelstrom of chaos, enabling him to identify specific civilians by their unique vocal patterns and desperate emotional signatures. There was Marcus Venn, for instance, a mid-level administrative clerk whose urgent request for additional power cells had been approved because his position strategically controlled a vital choke point that would be prohibitively expensive to retake if it fell. Then there was Sarah Chen, a medical technician whose desperate, heart-wrenching plea for evacuation assistance had been ruthlessly categorized as low priority simply because her sector was classified as ultimately expendable territory. Each fading voice represented a singular human life, a unique individual replete with a personal history, cherished relationships, deeply ingrained fears, and fleeting dreams. The sergeant's augmented memory could instantly access their complete, comprehensive assessment profiles, recalling every minute detail of their background data, their precise skill evaluations, and their ultimate priority classifications. He knew that Marcus had 2 young children safely, for now, in the high-security residential zone, that Sarah had bravely volunteered for frontline medical duty despite her relatively low combat rating, and that both of them would, in all likelihood, be dead within the next few agonizing hours as the relentless Tyrannid advance inevitably overwhelmed their positions. This chilling knowledge affected him no more profoundly than distant weather reports or mundane equipment maintenance schedules. His brutal conditioning had been meticulously designed to suppress precisely these kinds of disruptive emotional responses, thereby maintaining the absolute psychological clarity necessary for optimal, ruthless, tactical decision-making. Individual casualties were always an inevitable consequence in any military operation, acceptable losses that had been precisely calculated and meticulously accounted for within the vast, impersonal, overall strategic framework. The outer perimeter managed to hold for precisely 37 minutes before the first major, devastating breakthrough occurred in Sector 9. A predatory pack of raveners had cunningly tunneled beneath the hastily constructed defensive positions, erupting from the ground directly behind the civilian gun emplacements and savagely slaughtering the beleaguered defenders before they could even begin to respond to the sudden, horrifying threat. This critical breach allowed several hundred more ravenous hormagaunts to swiftly penetrate the outer zone, initiating the systematic and relentless consumption of infrastructure and personnel, a process that would gradually but inexorably weaken the city's overall defensive capability. Captain Vex observed these grim developments through the tactical network, meticulously noting the precise timing and exact location of each devastating breakthrough with the same dispassionate, analytical attention he might have devoted to studying a particularly complex and vital equipment manual. The outer perimeter had, in fact, been conservatively expected to fall within the first hour of sustained, brutal assault. The fact that it had managed to hold for a surprising 37 minutes represented a performance slightly above projected parameters, grimly suggesting that the civilian defenders were fighting with a fiercer, more desperate determination than the cold statistical models had accurately predicted. This unexpected data would prove immensely valuable for future assessment calculations. Apparently, the chilling proximity of imminent death possessed the morbid power to motivate even low-priority individuals to exceed their projected performance levels. Such hard-won knowledge would be ruthlessly incorporated into revised algorithms, allowing for even more accurate and cynical predictions of defensive capability during similar future operations. The captain's cold attention was then drawn to a series of increasingly urgent reports streaming in from the outer residential zones, precisely the areas where the lowest priority civilians had been cruelly concentrated within the temporary shelter facilities. These massive utilitarian structures had been designed to house hundreds of thousands of people in conditions that met only the bare minimum sustainability requirements, all while keeping them safely and conveniently out of the way of more important defensive operations. Unfortunately, and predictably, the ravenous tyrannids had quickly identified these facilities as particularly rich and easily accessible feeding opportunities. The monstrous bioships in orbit had been conducting detailed, invasive biological scans of the city since their arrival, meticulously mapping concentrations of organic matter with the same chilling thoroughness that human military forces applied to mapping strategic resources. Consequently, the shelter facilities glowed on their xenosensors like irresistible beacons, massive accumulations of biomass conveniently gathered in seemingly defensible positions. 3 gargantuan Trigon biotitans had then erupted from underground tunnel networks, surging directly beneath the largest shelter complex. Their massive forms burst through the floor with devastating, unholy effect. The facility's pitiful, minimal defensive systems were utterly overwhelmed in mere seconds, leaving hundreds of thousands of terrified civilians trapped within a structure that had in an instant become their horrific, inescapable tomb. Their desperate, dying screams filled the emergency communication channels, heart-rending pleas for evacuation assistance that could not and would not be answered, because absolutely no resources had been allocated for such contingencies as civilian rescue. Captain Vex absorbed these harrowing reports with the same cold, professional detachment he habitually applied to all battlefield intelligence. The complete loss of the shelter complex had been fully anticipated as a highly likely outcome, already factored into the ruthless overall casualty projections for the first phase of the siege. The civilians contained within it had been dispassionately classified as utterly expendable from the very beginning, their collective deaths serving the grim strategic purpose of diverting Tyranid resources away from more critical, more valuable targets. The fact that their final moments were undoubtedly filled with unspeakable terror and profound betrayal was regrettable, perhaps, but ultimately and utterly irrelevant to the grand strategic calculus. Wars, after all, were not won by sentiment or delicate humanitarian considerations. They were won only by making the hardest, most brutal choices that preserved what could be preserved, while ruthlessly sacrificing what must be sacrificed for the chilling greater good of the Imperium. In the high-priority residential sectors, however, the situation was starkly, profoundly different. These privileged areas had been heavily reinforced with the absolute best defensive systems available, meticulously manned by carefully selected personnel with proven combat experience, and generously equipped with more than sufficient supplies to withstand even extended siege conditions. When Tyranid assault forces inevitably probed these bastions, they were met by devastatingly concentrated firepower from heavy weapon emplacements, coordinated counterattacks launched by Space Marine tactical squads, and sophisticated defensive measures that had been designed specifically to counter advanced Xenos biowarfare tactics. The stark contrast was, of course, entirely intentional and brutally efficient. Citizens with high assessment ratings found themselves ensconced in positions that were as secure and impregnable as Imperial military engineering could possibly make them, their safety prioritized meticulously above all other considerations. Their children attended emergency schools deep within reinforced bunkers, taught by educators who had been rigorously selected for their exceptional ability to maintain morale and educational standards, even under conditions of extreme, protracted stress. Their medical needs were attended to by the most experienced practitioners available, utilizing state-of-the-art equipment and specialized supplies that had been reserved specifically for critical personnel. These fortunate few lived in conditions that, while undoubtedly austere by peacetime standards, represented an almost unimaginable luxury compared to the horrific fate of those who had been ruthlessly deemed expendable. They ate regular, nourishing meals prepared from high-quality rations and slept in climate-controlled environments meticulously protected by multiple, interlocking layers of defensive systems. They received regular, carefully curated updates about the progress of the battle, information explicitly designed to help maintain their confidence in the ultimate success of the defensive effort. Most importantly, they were never, under any circumstances, told about the horrific, anonymous sacrifices being made on their behalf. They were never informed about the millions of their fellow citizens who were dying slow, agonizing deaths to buy precious time and vital resources for their preservation. The ruthless assessment protocol included strict, draconian information control measures, specifically designed to prevent precisely this kind of disturbing knowledge from ever reaching high-priority individuals. Morale among critical personnel was itself considered a strategic resource, a vital commodity that could be dangerously compromised by unnecessary exposure to difficult, inconvenient truths. Brother Apothecary Sanguis moved methodically through the high-priority medical facilities, meticulously monitoring the physical health and psychological condition of the preserved population with the same unwavering thoroughness he would have applied to maintaining the combat readiness of his own battle brothers. His enhanced Astartes senses could detect subtle stress hormones, minute nutritional deficiencies, and even the earliest nascent signs of psychological breakdown with remarkable preternatural precision, enabling him to prescribe targeted treatments and interventions long before any problems became serious enough to compromise individual effectiveness. This work was surprisingly complex and demanding, requiring not just extensive medical expertise, but also a deeply sophisticated understanding of human psychology and intricate social dynamics. Many of the preserved civilians were experiencing profound guilt about their elevated, privileged status, persistent worry about friends and family members who had been relegated to lower priority categories, and pervasive general anxiety about the progress of the brutal battle raging relentlessly around them. These intense emotional responses had to be managed with extreme care to prevent them from developing into more serious, debilitating psychological disorders that could severely affect overall productivity and, crucially, morale. The apothecary judiciously employed a precise combination of pharmaceutical interventions, therapeutic counseling, and stringently controlled information distribution to maintain optimal psychological conditions among the preserved population. Anti-anxiety medications were discreetly administered to individuals displaying signs of acute stress. Group therapy sessions offered a controlled environment for people to process their harrowing experiences, with trained facilitators carefully guiding conversations away from potentially disruptive or seditious topics. Regular briefings provided only carefully selected information about military progress, always emphasizing positive developments while subtly but firmly downplaying any setbacks or casualties. It was a comprehensive, highly effective system for maintaining human resources in peak psychological and physical condition. A protocol as sophisticated as any equipment maintenance regimen and considerably more challenging to meticulously implement. The apothecary took a cold, professional pride in his unwavering ability to keep the preserved population functioning at optimal levels despite the extraordinary, soul-crushing stress of their desperate circumstances. Outside the relatively protected zones, the brutal battle for Tertius Majoris continued with relentlessly escalating intensity. The relentless Tyrannid assault had swiftly evolved beyond simple, blunt frontal attacks to include increasingly sophisticated tactical maneuvers, chillingly demonstrating the hive mind's rapidly growing, monstrous understanding of human defensive strategies. Bioships in orbit began coordinating devastating orbital strikes, precisely targeting specific infrastructure nodes, seeking to disrupt critical power distribution, sever communication networks, and cripple transportation systems that were vital to supporting the city's defensive capabilities. Swift, flying Tyrannid creatures conducted ruthless aerial reconnaissance, meticulously identifying weak points in the defensive perimeter and instantly relaying this vital information back to ground forces through the vast, horrific synaptic network that linked all Tyrannid organisms into a single, terrifyingly coordinated intelligence. Within mere hours, concentrated, brutal attacks began targeting these newly identified vulnerable positions with horrifying surgical precision, starkly demonstrating the hive mind's terrifying ability to rapidly adapt and learn from dynamic battlefield conditions. The middle-tier civilian populations, those deemed valuable enough to preserve but not deemed critical enough to receive maximum, uncompromising protection, found themselves bearing the full, devastating brunt of this adaptive, ruthless strategy. Their desperate defensive positions occupied the crucial, contested space between the utterly expendable outer zones and the heavily fortified inner core, making them the primary, blood-soaked targets for Tyrannid forces relentlessly seeking to penetrate deeper into the city's vital defensive structure. These beleaguered civilians fought with a desperate, almost suicidal courage, knowing implicitly that retreat would mean abandoning their assigned and often fatal roles in the chilling preservation hierarchy. They had been solemnly told that their sacrifice was absolutely necessary for the greater good, that their grim willingness to hold contested ground would allow more valuable assets to be protected from the Xenos' relentless advance. What they had not been told was the horrifying truth, that their positions had been deliberately, ruthlessly selected for their inherent expendability, chosen specifically because they could be abandoned without compromising any truly critical defensive objectives. Corporal Helena Voss, a grim-faced member of the civilian auxiliary forces, crouched low behind a hastily erected makeshift barricade in Sector 15. Her laser gun, now dangerously hot from continuous, desperate firing, shuddered in her grip as wave after wave of ravenous hormagaunts crashed relentlessly against her unit's beleaguered position. Her unit had defiantly held the same vital intersection for over 6 grueling hours, watching their dwindling numbers steadily shrink as precious ammunition ran perilously low and casualties relentlessly mounted. She had desperately requested reinforcements 4 times through the Vox network. Each plea met only with hollow promises of support that never, agonizingly, materialized. Through the swirling smoke and absolute chaos, she could distinctly see the massive, distinctive silhouettes of Space Marines operating in adjacent sectors, their colossal forms moving with lethal precision as they brutally eliminated Xenos threats with terrifying, almost casual efficiency. Yet, none of them moved to support her unit's exposed position, despite the obvious, undeniable tactical value of the critical intersection she was so desperately defending. A cold, creeping suspicion began to take root that her unit had simply been forgotten, left to hold an ultimately unimportant position while far more significant battles raged elsewhere. The grim truth, however, was far more disturbing than mere neglect. Corporal Voss and her entire unit had been dispassionately classified as acceptable losses. Their inevitable sacrifice was coldly calculated to provide crucial tactical intelligence about Tyrannid assault patterns, all while buying precious time for more valuable assets to consolidate their formidable defenses. Their desperate, doomed fight was being meticulously monitored through unseen surveillance networks. Every agonizing detail of their engagement ruthlessly recorded and analyzed for future reference and strategic refinement. When her position finally, inevitably fell, overwhelmed by a coordinated, overwhelming assault from multiple Tyrannid bioforms, the invaluable data meticulously collected from her unit's final, desperate stand would be immediately incorporated into updated tactical databases. Her death, and the countless deaths of her comrades, would grimly contribute to the ruthless refinement of the assessment protocol, ultimately helping to improve the chilling accuracy of future calculations regarding civilian combat effectiveness and optimal resource allocation strategies. Brother Sergeant Maximus observed the grim fall of Sector 15 through his helmet's tactical display, dispassionately noting every precise timing and all tactical details with cold, professional interest. The civilian defenders, it seemed, had performed slightly better than projected, managing to hold their precarious position for 6 grueling hours and 14 minutes against the relentless, sustained assault. This represented a statistically significant variance of approximately 8% from initial predictions. Invaluable information that would be meticulously calibrated into future defensive calculations. The sergeant's augmented memory automatically cataloged these grim engagement details, meticulously storing them alongside thousands of other critical tactical observations that had been relentlessly accumulated over centuries of brutal warfare. Each horrific battle contributed directly to his ever-growing understanding of combat dynamics. Each agonizing sacrifice provided crucial data points that further improved his ability to make accurate, dispassionate assessments regarding military capability and precise resource allocation requirements. He felt no particular emotion regarding the civilians' deaths. Neither satisfaction nor regret registered within his enhanced psyche. They had merely fulfilled their assigned function within the grim overall defensive strategy, their sacrifice contributing directly to objectives that extended far beyond their individual, fleeting fates. The ruthless assessment protocol had meticulously determined their optimal utilization, and they had performed precisely within acceptable parameters until the inevitable, predetermined conclusion of their assigned role. This, he knew, was the harsh, undeniable nature of warfare at the colossal scale required for the Imperium's very survival. Individual lives, no matter how precious or irreplaceable they might seem to those who live them, were ultimately nothing more than expendable resources in the vast, cold calculus of species preservation. The Space Marines, in their unwavering duty, understood this brutal truth with perfect, crystalline clarity, their enhanced minds completely freed from the distracting emotional attachments that perpetually clouded mortal judgment. As the brutal siege entered its agonizing second day, the full, horrifying scope of the assessment protocol's ruthless implementation became increasingly, terrifyingly apparent to those few civilians who possessed the keen intelligence and sharp observational skills necessary to recognize the emerging, grim patterns. The city's vast population, she realized, was being systematically sorted, categorized, and consumed according to chilling, predetermined priority rankings, with each group's ultimate fate irrevocably determined by cold, dispassionate calculations that had been made long before the first tyrannid organisms ever reached the outer perimeter. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a senior research scientist classified as high priority due to her invaluable expertise in xenobiology, began to grasp the true, terrifying nature of their grim situation as she toiled in the secured laboratory facilities deep within the heavily fortified inner defensive zone. Her critical research assignment involved meticulously analyzing captured tyrannid biosamples, searching for potential weaknesses that could be ruthlessly exploited by human forces. Work that was clearly deemed paramount, critical enough to justify significant resource allocation for her protection and support. But her rigorous scientific training had instilled in her the ability to recognize subtle patterns and draw precise conclusions even from incomplete data, invaluable skills that proved disturbingly, horrifyingly applicable to her current, desperate circumstances. She noticed, with growing unease, that certain categories of personnel were conspicuously, chillingly absent from the high security zones. She observed the systematic, unyielding allocation of resources and supplies according to principles that seemed to have little, if any, relationship to immediate military necessity. She began to suspect, with a rising dread, that she and her colleagues were not merely being protected, but were being coldly preserved according to utilitarian criteria that treated human lives as mere strategic assets rather than as individual beings truly deserving of equal consideration. Her growing, horrifying understanding filled her with a profound, crushing sense of complicity in something that violated every sacred principle of human dignity and moral responsibility she had ever held dear. She was alive and relatively safe because countless other people, individuals perhaps equally deserving of protection, had been ruthlessly deemed expendable by cold, dispassionate calculations she had played no role in making, nor even been aware of. Her specialized expertise in xenobiology alone made her valuable enough to preserve, while millions of others perished simply because they lacked any skills that the ruthless assessment protocol considered strategically important or truly indispensable. The grim knowledge was almost unbearable, a corrosive acid eating at her soul. But she was utterly trapped by circumstances that offered absolutely no meaningful, viable alternatives. Speaking out, she knew, would accomplish nothing except to severely jeopardize her own precarious status and quite possibly fatally compromise the defensive effort, an effort that represented the only remaining desperate hope for anyone's survival. Refusing to cooperate, she understood with chilling clarity, would not save a single soul from the approaching doom, expendable populations, but would certainly jeopardize her own existence and the critical research she was conducting that could benefit the broader war effort. She continued her work with growing reluctance. Each discovery about tyrannid biology felt like a profound betrayal of those who had been sacrificed to make her survival possible. The profound ethical dilemma of her role weighed heavily on her spirit, a palpable burden that served as an unceasing reminder of the stark moral compromises exacted by the desperate struggle for survival. Captain Vex observed these intricate psychological shifts with dispassionate analysis through the comprehensive surveillance systems that tracked all personnel within the high-security zones. Dr. Hawthorne's emotional state was firmly within the expected parameters, considering the extreme moral pressures associated with her privileged preservation. Despite her internal turmoil, her output remained consistently high, a clear signal that her crucial work could proceed unimpeded without requiring immediate psychological intervention. If her condition deteriorated to the point where it compromised her effectiveness, a comprehensive suite of medical protocols stood ready to address any such decline. Pharmaceutical agents could be deployed to subtly recalibrate brain chemistry, dampening emotional responses that threatened to impede optimal cognitive function. Advanced psychological reconditioning methods offered pathways to guide individuals toward perspectives more aligned with their assigned roles and overarching responsibilities. For the most severe cases, memory modification procedures presented a final solution, capable of excising troublesome recollections and supplanting them with more advantageous mental content. These drastic measures were viewed not as ethical dilemmas, but as standard operational maintenance, akin to routine servicing of complex machinery or critical software updates. From this detached vantage point, human consciousness itself was merely another sophisticated technology, occasionally necessitating recalibration to sustain peak operational efficiency. The overarching assessment protocol meticulously outlined these management guidelines, guaranteeing that indispensable personnel remained fully productive, irrespective of their personal, emotional, or psychological responses to the grim realities of their preserved status. The captain's attention was drawn to a flurry of urgent tactical dispatches from the beleaguered outer defensive sectors. The Tyranid assault had escalated dramatically, with the Hive fleet pouring an ever-increasing deluge of bioresources into the brutal ground campaign. Towering Carnifex biotitans, living engines of destruction, now directly assailed the middle-tier defensive positions. Their grotesque living artillery systems unleashed volleys of organic projectiles, capable of pulverizing even reinforced bunker structures upon the civilian defense lines. Meanwhile, myriad flying Tyrannid organisms had decisively seized air superiority across vast swathes of the city, their relentless swarm attacks utterly overwhelming the meager anti-aircraft emplacements tasked with protecting civilian zones. Stripped of vital air cover, ground forces became grievously exposed to coordinated aerial assaults that could materialize from any vector with terrifying swiftness and minimal warning. Most alarmingly, intelligence indicated that the hive mind had apparently deciphered the systematic patterns inherent in the assessment protocol's implementation. Tyranid forces were now displaying a chilling prescience, progressively concentrating their assaults on high-value targets, specifically aiming to neutralize the most strategically vital assets rather than merely indulging in indiscriminate biomass consumption. This represented a degree of tactical cunning and adaptive intelligence far exceeding initial defensive projections. The ramifications were profoundly unsettling. If the Tyranids could identify and target priority populations with precision, the very bedrock of the assessment protocol would be utterly compromised. The grim sacrifices of expendable populations would be rendered utterly futile if the very assets they were intended to safeguard could be so readily pinpointed and destroyed by targeted enemy strikes. Captain Vex began implementing a series of urgent, adaptive countermeasures, relocating critical personnel to positions engineered for greater obfuscation and defense against Xenos assault. Elaborate decoy facilities were rapidly established to sow confusion within enemy reconnaissance efforts. Communication protocols underwent immediate modification, designed to thwart the Tyranids' ability to triangulate command structures through traffic analysis. Further layers of robust defensive screening were rapidly erected around the most vital preservation zones. These extraordinary measures marked a profound departure from the initial assessment calculations, demanding significant resource reallocations entirely unforeseen in the original planning. With cold pragmatism, the captain authorized these redeployments by reclassifying specific middle-tier populations as newly expendable, thereby liberating the necessary personnel and equipment to bolster the enhanced protection of truly critical assets. This grim directive was issued without any prior consultation or notification to the affected individuals, who would only discover their devastating change in status as vital support and supplies ceased reaching their positions. Brother Codicarius Malphus of the esteemed Angel's sanguinary librarium stood in the somber depths of the planetary governor's palace's meditation chambers. His formidable psychic consciousness reached out through the tumultuous currents of the warp, diligently monitoring the inexorable advance of the Tyrannid hive fleet. Through his potent psyker abilities, he sensed the chilling shadow in the warp that invariably heralded all major Tyrannid incursions, a suffocating nullification of all psychic activity, forging vast pockets of absolute silence within the immaterium. Yet even amidst that profound stillness, those possessing acute psychic sensitivity and extensive training could discern faint, subtle patterns. The hive mind's intricate tactical decision-making processes left behind elusive psychic traces, intelligible only to the most experienced battle psychers, faint echoes that offered glimpses into the alien intelligence's chilling priorities and overarching strategic assessments. What the Codicarius perceived through his warp-touched senses engendered a deepening sense of dread concerning the ultimate efficacy of their current defensive posture. The Tyranids were not merely mindless consumers. They were acutely observing human defensive patterns, meticulously learning to unravel the logical frameworks underpinning imperial military doctrine. The assessment protocol, with its rigidly systematic categorization and resource allocation schemas, was inadvertently generating precisely the kind of predictable behaviors that the hive mind's intelligence was inherently optimized to detect and ruthlessly exploit. Each decision, meticulously executed according to the protocol's guidelines, generated invaluable data points that the Tyranids could relentlessly analyze and subsequently counter. Every personnel movement, every resource deployment, every tactical choice unwittingly forged discernible patterns that the alien intelligence could rapidly learn to anticipate and neutralize. The very systematic efficiency that rendered the protocol initially effective was simultaneously rendering it catastrophically vulnerable to countermeasures from an adversary capable of processing and reacting to tactical information with superhuman velocity. The Codicarius swiftly transmitted his grave concerns through the intricate psychic communication network interconnecting the Space Marine command echelons, his mental missives resonating with the chilling gravity of urgent tactical intelligence. Captain Vex absorbed this crucial intelligence with the same unflappable professional focus he accorded all battlefield reports. However, the profound implications were starkly evident, compelling an immediate fundamental reassessment of strategic priorities. If the assessment protocol was, in fact, undermining their defensive capabilities by inadvertently creating predictable patterns, then immediate and radical modifications would be indispensable to preserve tactical viability. This presented an immensely intricate set of challenges, for the systematic methodologies that made the protocol so remarkably efficient were precisely what enabled its large-scale deployment, essential for planetary defense operations. Thus, the imperative emerged to deliberately inject random elements, specifically designed to thoroughly disrupt the Tyranids' insidious pattern analysis capabilities. Resource allocations would now have to incorporate deliberately inefficient choices, serving no discernible strategic purpose beyond deliberately perplexing enemy intelligence assessments. Personnel movements would demand calculated inconsistencies, sacrificing optimal positioning in favor of the paramount goal of tactical unpredictability. These radical alterations would, without question, diminish the overall efficacy of the preservation effort, leading to an increase in casualty rates among both the designated expendable and critical populations. Yet, the chilling alternative was total tactical transparency, offering the hive mind an unobstructed view to anticipate and counter every single facet of their defensive strategy, with potentially cataclysmic outcomes. With a hardened resolve, Captain Vex sanctioned the immediate implementation of these randomization protocols, stoically accepting the inevitable reduction in efficiency as a non-negotiable cost for preserving strategic viability. The brutal mathematics of survival were morphing into an ever more labyrinthine equation, demanding intricate calculations that meticulously balanced an escalating multitude of variables in ways that severely strained even the enhanced cognitive capacities of Astartes. The inaugural randomization measures were swiftly put into effect on the third day of the siege, coinciding with Tyrannid forces reaching the middle-tier defensive lines and commencing their methodical assault on the city's secondary defensive perimeter. Without a whisper of warning or accompanying explanation, certain individuals previously classified as high priority found themselves abruptly reassigned to lower security postings, while conversely, some populations previously deemed expendable were unexpectedly relocated to superior, better protected facilities. These jarring alterations flagrantly contravened the inherent logical structure of the assessment protocol, generating bewildering inconsistencies that perplexed not only the bewildered civilians, but also the lower-ranking Space Marines tasked with their execution. Families torn asunder by the rigid priority classifications suddenly found themselves unexpectedly reunited, while others, who had enjoyed improved circumstances, discovered their fortunes capriciously reversed without any coherent rationale. The psychological repercussions of these sudden, inexplicable shifts were profound and devastating, eroding the fragile sense of predictability and fairness that had previously enabled many civilians to grudgingly accept their prescribed roles within the preservation hierarchy. A pervasive sense of distrust began to fester, as people suspected their destinies were now being shaped by arbitrary whims rather than by any rational, objective assessment criteria, inevitably leading to spiraling anxiety and a marked decline in cooperation with military directives. However, the tactical advantages of this engineered chaos became almost immediately manifest. Tyrannid assault patterns, which had exhibited increasingly surgical precision in targeting high-value positions, now grew noticeably diffuse as the hive mind grappled to discern any consistent patterns within the reshuffled human defensive arrangements. Enemy attack effectiveness plummeted as Xeno's forces frequently found themselves engaging targets that proved significantly less strategically vital than their meticulous analysis had forecast. The deliberate randomization had successfully injected a potent dose of chaos into both factions of the conflict, undeniably diminishing the overall efficiency of human defensive operations, yet simultaneously crippling the effectiveness of Tyrannid tactical responses. It represented a radical, deliberate embrace of confusion as a potent strategic asset, consciously sacrificing peak performance in exchange for the invaluable dividend of tactical unpredictability. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne became a direct recipient of the randomization protocols when she was summarily transferred from her meticulously secured laboratory facility to a hastily organized research station nestled within one of the hotly contested middle sectors. The official narrative cited pressing resource allocation requirements and immediate tactical necessities. Yet, Dr. Hawthorne, with her keen intellect, immediately grasped the deeper truth. Her reassignment was a calculated, deliberate injection of inefficiency into the previously rigid preservation system. Her new posting was demonstrably more perilous, characterized by minimal defensive fortifications and notoriously unreliable supply lines. The research amenities were starkly inferior to the state-of-the-art facilities she had abandoned, inevitably diminishing her capacity to contribute effectively to the crucial xenobiology analysis that had until now underscored her high-priority status. The reassignment appeared to flagrantly violate every fundamental principle of rational resource utilization that should have logically guided military decision-making. Nevertheless, as she commenced her work in this new, precarious environment, she began to discern a critical shift. Tyranid attacks against research facilities had grown markedly less precise and effective compared to the siege's initial days. Previously, Xenos forces had exhibited an unnerving, almost supernatural aptitude for identifying and surgically targeting the most vital scientific installations. Now their strikes appeared more indiscriminate, strongly implying that the human defensive strategy had succeeded in profoundly disorienting their pattern analysis capabilities. The randomization, despite its inherent brutality, was proving effective, even as it dramatically amplified the personal perils confronting individuals such as herself. Her diminished security and substandard working conditions were, in this grim calculus, deemed acceptable costs for sustaining the strategic unpredictability vital to preventing the Tyranids from optimizing their relentless assault tactics. She acknowledged that her chances of survival in this new posting were significantly reduced. Yet paradoxically, her demise would be less predictable to enemy forces, thereby impeding their ability to efficiently concentrate their destructive power on truly critical targets. The moral implications of this new paradigm were truly staggering. The original assessment protocol had coldly stratified human lives according to their perceived strategic value. Now, even this systematic framework was being intentionally subverted, deliberately corrupted by random elements specifically engineered to befuddle the alien intelligence. People were perishing not because their lives had been definitively judged worthless, but because their very deaths were now deemed tactically expedient in forging patterns that were exponentially more challenging for Xenos forces to analyze and, consequently, to counter. She persevered in her xenobiological research with a renewed, grim determination, acutely aware that her contributions remained vital despite the amplified dangers of her present circumstances. The critical knowledge she unearthed regarding Tyranid biology could still significantly bolster defensive effectiveness, even if her own continued existence had been rendered demonstrably less certain by complex tactical considerations that transcended her individual comprehension or control. As the siege entered its fourth brutal day, casualty rates soared, drastically surpassing all initial projections. The randomization protocols had undeniably succeeded in disarraying Tyranid tactical analysis. However, this triumph came at the steep price of severely degrading human defensive efficiency to levels that gravely jeopardized the overarching viability of the entire preservation endeavor. Captain Vex found himself navigating an increasingly perilous tightrope, meticulously balancing the imperative of tactical unpredictability against the absolute necessity of strategic effectiveness, constantly tweaking randomization parameters in real time as the fluid battlefield conditions relentlessly shifted. The civilian population had begun to understand, in piecemeal and often terrifyingly incomplete ways, that their individual fates were being dictated by cold, impersonal calculations they could neither influence nor fully grasp. Whispers of disquieting rumors rippled through the contested sectors. Low, furtive conversations probed the true, horrifying nature of the assessment protocol and the inscrutable reasons behind the seemingly arbitrary reversals in individual assignments and resource allocations. A desperate few civilians endeavored to game the opaque system, deliberately altering their behaviors in hopes of swaying their priority classifications or securing more favorable reassignments. Many others, however, sank into a fatalistic resignation, recognizing their profound powerlessness to alter outcomes shaped by forces utterly beyond their knowledge or influence. But a select few, gifted with the acuity to discern the larger, more unsettling patterns, began to grasp the horrific truth. They were unwitting participants in a vast, macabre, tactical experiment. Their very lives served as mere variables within intricate calculations, all designed to optimize resistance against an alien intelligence possessing the chilling capacity to learn from and adapt to human decision-making patterns. This stark realization was simultaneously terrifying and, in a twisted way, strangely liberating, providing a grim framework for understanding their harrowing circumstances that transcended mere individual concerns about survival and preservation. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the esteemed Angel's sanguinary First Company materialized on Tertius Majoris during the fourth brutal night of the siege. His formidable strike cruiser, a spearhead of imperial might, translated directly from the warp into the fiercely contested orbital space above the beleaguered planet. His paramount mission was to conduct a rigorous, impartial assessment of the assessment protocol's implementation and to definitively determine whether the current defensive strategy warranted continuation, modification, or outright abandonment in favor of radically alternative approaches. The veteran captain's extensive experience honed across dozens of similar, harrowing operations on countless other worlds afforded him a singularly unique perspective on the immense tactical challenges confronting the defenders of Tertius Majoris. He possessed the rare capacity to critically appraise both the cold, mathematical elegance of the assessment calculations and the stark, brutal practicalities of deploying such systematic methodologies under the extreme duress of combat against an endlessly adaptable foe. His preliminary assessment, delivered with characteristic Space Marine gravitas, was profoundly sobering. The protocol had, in its own brutal fashion, succeeded in preserving an estimated 4 billion civilians within relatively secure enclaves, effectively shielding critical personnel and strategic resources from the most devastating impacts of the Tyrannid assault. Yet this grim success came at an utterly enormous cost, with casualty rates among the middle and lower tier populations spiraling far beyond sustainable levels. More critically still, the unforeseen necessity for randomization measures was fundamentally eroding the very systematic efficiency that had, ironically, made the protocol initially viable. Captain Thaddeus swiftly convened an emergency council of war, assembling the disparate senior commanders, each responsible for a distinct facet of the sprawling defensive effort. The ensuing discussions unfolded with the austere clinical precision that rigorously defined all Space Marine tactical deliberations. Nevertheless, the palpable undercurrent of profound tension was unmistakably evident to any observer possessing sufficient experience to discern it. Captain Vex, unwavering, robustly defended his implementation of the assessment protocol, meticulously citing statistical evidence that underscored its undeniable effectiveness in preserving critical assets amidst utterly impossible odds. His cold, logical calculations compellingly demonstrated that the systematic approach had yielded preservation rates significantly superior to what traditional defensive strategies could ever hope to achieve against comparable Tyrannid incursions. Brother Codicarius Malphus then relayed his grim psychic intelligence, indicating that the hive mind was relentlessly continuing its adaptive tactical evolution, already learning to neutralize even the very randomization measures that had initially disoriented its pattern analysis capabilities. He issued a stark warning. Further, more radical modifications would be indispensable to sustain any semblance of defensive effectiveness, alterations that would inevitably demand even greater departures from optimal resource allocation strategies. Techmarine Korath, grim-faced, presented stark infrastructure assessments, revealing that the city's defensive capacity was eroding far more rapidly than anticipated, with critical systems progressively failing under the relentless strain of sustained combat operations. His chilling projections indicated an inevitable total defensive collapse within a mere 6 days, unless drastic reconfigurations were immediately applied to resource allocation priorities. The overarching tactical picture was starkly unambiguous. The assessment protocol was simultaneously achieving a degree of success while profoundly failing, preserving invaluable assets, yet consuming vital resources at an utterly unsustainable velocity. The very systematic methodology that rendered it effective was simultaneously rendering it fatally predictable to an alien intelligence that could adapt with terrifying speed, far outpacing the evolution of human tactical responses. Captain Thaddeus now confronted the quintessential, agonizing decision that so often defined the true nature of Space Marine Command. Should he persist with a strategy that, while currently functional, was rapidly becoming catastrophically vulnerable, or should he decisively abandon systematic approaches in favor of more fluid, tactical methods that, though potentially less efficient in the short term, promised greater long-term sustainability? His choice would irrevocably determine the destinies of billions of Imperial citizens, dictating not merely who would endure and who would perish, but also how their inevitable deaths would be grimly factored into the broader, unforgiving calculus of Imperial survival. The Council ultimately arrived at its grim conclusion through a rigorous, methodical analysis of all available options. Each viable alternative was dispassionately evaluated against a complex array of criteria, encompassing tactical effectiveness, resource sustainability, strategic unpredictability, and projected long-term preservation outcomes. The final decision was rendered utterly devoid of sentiment or emotional consideration, grounded solely in a cold, mathematical assessment of probable results across a spectrum of potential scenarios. The verdict was unequivocal. The assessment protocol would be summarily abandoned. In its stead, they would implement a radical new approach, one that explicitly prioritized tactical flexibility over systematic efficiency, thereby accepting demonstrably reduced preservation rates in exchange for the paramount goal of strategic sustainability. The painstakingly calculated priority hierarchies would be utterly dissolved, to be supplanted by fluid, responsive resource allocation systems capable of instantaneous adaptation to rapidly shifting battlefield conditions, critically avoiding the creation of predictable patterns ripe for enemy exploitation. This chilling decision starkly implied that the immense sacrifices made during the first 4 brutal days of the siege had been, in a broader strategic sense, largely meaningless. The expendable populations, whose lives had been grimly expended to safeguard more valuable assets, had not in reality contributed to any sustainable long-term defensive strategy. Instead, their deaths were reduced to mere tactical experiments, generating data points within calculations that were now being ruthlessly discarded as the Space Marines adapted to the evolving enemy countermeasures. Captain Vex received these stark orders with the same unflinching professional discipline and dispassionate resolve he had displayed throughout the entirety of the crisis. The assessment protocol had been his direct responsibility to implement, a task he had executed with exceptional, almost clinical efficiency, even under the most harrowing circumstances. Its ultimate abandonment reflected not a failure in his execution or judgment, but rather the inexorable demands of rapidly changing tactical requirements. The transition to the flexible resource allocation strategy commenced without delay, paradoxically implemented with the same systematic precision that had defined the original assessment deployment. All previous priority classifications were immediately dissolved. Defensive assignments were swiftly redistributed in accordance with immediate tactical exigencies, and resource allocation systems were reconfigured from the ground up to facilitate rapid adaptation to the ever-evolving battlefield conditions. The psychological impact on the civilian populace was both immediate and devastatingly severe. Individuals who had, however, reluctantly accepted their predefined roles within the rigid preservation hierarchy suddenly discovered themselves thrust into utterly disparate circumstances, devoid of any explanation for the seismic shifts or guidance on how to interpret their radically altered situations. The fragile predictability that had allowed many to cling to a semblance of psychological stability was brutally ripped away, replaced by an omnipresent uncertainty that teetered on the brink of outright chaos. Naturally, some civilians greeted these profound changes with a desperate sense of relief, particularly those who had previously languished under the expendable classification and now found themselves granted access to superior resources and enhanced protection. Conversely, many others, particularly those who had previously enjoyed the privilege of high-priority categories, perceived this abrupt transition as a profound betrayal of unspoken promises, assumptions implicit in their former preferential treatment, though never formally articulated. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne observed the systematic dissolution of the assessment protocol with a profound mixture of emotions. While the previous systematic approach had been morally disquieting in its reduction of individual human lives to cold, strategic calculations, it had at minimum offered a grim framework for comprehending the underlying logic dictating individual fates. The radical new flexible allocation system, however, offered no such intellectual solace or clarity, leaving every individual equally adrift in a sea of uncertainty regarding their prospects for survival. She persevered with her vital xenobiology research, but with a heightened, chilling awareness that her work was now merely one variable among a constantly shifting multitude within tactical calculations, dynamically reconfigured in response to every evolving battlefield development. Her specialized expertise remained undeniably valuable, yet her continued preservation was no longer assured by any systematic prioritization. She understood with chilling clarity that she could perish at any given moment should tactical exigencies dictate it, her death serving whatever grim purpose the Space Marines deemed most appropriate for the prevailing circumstances. The profound moral burden of her situation had shifted in nature, but in no way had it diminished. Rather than being an unwitting accomplice in a system that systematically sacrificed others for her singular benefit, she was now an integral part of a terrifyingly fluid, tactical environment where any life, including her own, might be expendable at any moment for reasons that would remain perpetually unexplained or incomprehensible. This pervasive uncertainty was undeniably terrifying, yet, in a perverse way, it felt somehow more honest. A brutal mirror reflecting the true, unforgiving nature of their collective circumstances. Brother Sergeant Maximus, a seasoned veteran, guided his tactical squad through the fiercely contested middle sectors, rigorously implementing the new flexible allocation protocols with the innate adaptability that stood as the unwavering hallmark of Astartes' effectiveness. This radical transition demanded an unceasing, rapid assessment of localized conditions and the instantaneous reallocation of both personnel and resources in strict accordance with tactical requirements that mutated hourly as the fluid battlefield dynamics relentlessly evolved. The work proved considerably more demanding than the systematic adherence to assessment protocol guidelines, necessitating constant, on-the-fly decision-making and continuous adaptation to circumstances that utterly defied prediction or prior preparation. Crucially, however, it was infinitely more tactically responsive, empowering defensive strategies to evolve with the very same terrifying speed as tyrannid assault patterns, unburdened by the rigid constraints of predetermined hierarchies or immutable resource allocation frameworks. Individual civilians, once stratified by protocol, were now transmuted into dynamic tactical assets to be deployed purely according to immediate exigencies rather than any rigid, long-term strategic blueprint. Their unique skills, intrinsic capabilities, and even their fleeting survival prospects were subjected to continuous real-time evaluation, with assignments and resource allocations adjusted instantaneously to maximize current tactical effectiveness. While this approach was undeniably less efficient in its raw resource utilization, it was immeasurably more adaptable to the kind of rapidly shifting, unpredictable battlefield conditions that fundamentally defined warfare against the inscrutable hive mind intelligence. The seasoned sergeant observed these dramatic changes with a keen professional interest, carefully noting how the amplified tactical flexibility impacted both human performance and the ever-evolving tyrannid response patterns. The decisive abandonment of systematic approaches appeared to be effectively degrading enemy pattern analysis capabilities. Concomitantly, however, it was also diminishing the overall coordination and intrinsic efficiency of human defensive efforts. The grim, intricate trade-off between tactical unpredictability and operational effectiveness was now playing out in agonizing real time, with mounting casualties on both sides serving as stark, visceral metrics of tactical success or catastrophic failure. As the relentless siege dragged into its fifth grueling day, the true horrifying scope of the Space Marines' audacious tactical experiment began to reveal itself to those rare few possessing the intellectual breadth to truly comprehend it. The assessment protocol, it became chillingly clear, had never been conceived as a permanent, standalone defensive strategy. Instead, it was merely one meticulously engineered component within a grander, ongoing process of tactical adaptation, meticulously designed to isolate and identify optimal methodologies for waging war against the inscrutable hive mind intelligence. The billions of souls fighting and dying on Tertius Majoris were, in this grim calculus, unwitting participants in a vast, macabre field experiment. Their individual destinies were ruthlessly determined by the imperative to rigorously test disparate approaches to resource allocation and tactical decision-making under the extreme duress of active combat. The initial assessment protocol had furnished invaluable data concerning systematic defensive approaches, while its subsequent brutal abandonment would now generate crucial intelligence regarding flexible adaptation strategies. Both methodologies would be meticulously evaluated, rigorously refined, and ultimately incorporated into updated tactical doctrines, destined for deployment on countless other worlds, confronting similar existential Xenos threats. The hard-won knowledge gleaned from their immense sacrifices would ultimately serve to benefit future Imperial populations, significantly enhancing the Imperium's capacity to repel tyrannid incursions through a deeper, more refined understanding of optimal resource allocation strategies across a myriad of combat scenarios. This profound realization, when fully assimilated, was simultaneously horrifying and, in a strange, macabre way, oddly comforting. Their collective suffering, it transpired, served a purpose far transcending mere individual survival, contributing to an ever-accumulating repository of knowledge that could help safeguard human civilization against truly existential threats. They were not merely passive victims of alien aggression, but rather active, if unwitting, participants in humanity's relentless, ongoing struggle for survival amidst a hostile, uncaring galaxy. Captain Vex once again stood vigil upon the highest windswept spire of the planetary governor's palace, his augmented senses meticulously scanning the evolving tactical situation as the siege inexorably approached its crucial, decisive phase. The flexible allocation strategy, though brutal in its implementation, was indeed demonstrating promising early results, with tyrannid assault effectiveness visibly declining as their sophisticated pattern analysis capabilities were fundamentally disrupted by the unpredictable, seemingly chaotic, human tactical responses. Yet, this tactical success was exacted at an increasingly unsustainable cost. Casualty rates among the human defenders had spiraled significantly, an agonizing consequence of sacrificing systematic efficiency for the sake of tactical adaptability. Resource consumption, too, was dramatically exceeding all previous projections, as the deliberate abandonment of prioritization systems inevitably led to wasteful allocation patterns that could not, under any circumstances, be sustained indefinitely. The grim possibility began to crystallize in the captain's mind that perhaps both the rigidly systematic and the flexibly adaptive approaches were, in their core tenets, fundamentally flawed when arrayed against a hive mind intelligence operating on this gargantuan scale. Perhaps the very act of any systematic decision-making, be it through unyielding protocols or fluid adaptation, unavoidably created discernible patterns that a sufficiently advanced alien intelligence could and would inevitably learn to exploit. Perhaps, he mused with a chilling dread, truly effective defense against such an adversary demanded approaches that transcended rational calculation entirely, straying into realms of pure, unfathomable chaos. This heretical thought was profoundly disturbing to a mind rigorously honed and trained in the unwavering supremacy of logical analysis and strategic mathematical precision. Yet, the relentless war against the Great Devourer had consistently strained Imperial tactical doctrine to its breaking point. This eternal conflict had compelled the Imperium to forge innovations and implement radical adaptations, fundamentally challenging deeply held assumptions about military effectiveness and the very nature of conflict. As he grappled with these daunting possibilities, new intelligence began to filter in, detailing a disturbing evolution in the tyrannid assault pattern. The pervasive will of the hive mind appeared to be executing a drastic strategic pivot. It was abandoning its previous attempts to dissect and exploit human tactical patterns, instead favoring a brutally direct approach focused purely on the ravenous consumption of biomass, rather than sophisticated strategic targeting or maneuver. This profound shift suggested that the Space Marines' audacious tactical experiments had indeed been successful, critically disrupting the enemy's highly advanced analytical capabilities. So profound was this disruption that the Tyranids were seemingly reverting to more primal, instinctive assault methodologies, bypassing any pretense of complex strategy. However, this triumph came with a terrifying corollary. The battlefield was poised to descend into an even more extreme state of violence and chaos. The Xenos forces, now stripped of subtlety, would focus solely on achieving maximum destruction and overwhelming annihilation, casting aside any semblance of tactical precision. The final, most desperate phase of the siege was about to commence. All of the meticulously crafted calculations, every emergency protocol, and each desperate strategic innovation forged over the preceding 5 days would be ruthlessly tested. They would be thrown into a crucible of unimaginable violence, where their efficacy would determine whether even a fragment of Tertius Majoris could be salvaged from the Great Devourer's insatiable, endless hunger. Captain Vex braced himself for the ultimate trial of his deeply held tactical theories. He understood with grim clarity that the cold, mathematical precision of Space Marine warfare was on the verge of a cataclysmic collision with the raw, relentless, biological imperative of an alien species evolved for nothing but ravenous consumption and ceaseless, cancerous growth. The stringent assessment protocols and their eventual desperate abandonment had merely been preludes. They were grim harbingers of this very moment, when every systematic approach, every carefully constructed strategy would be brutally measured against the fundamental, unforgiving question of survival in its most primal and basic form. Across the beleaguered world, the 17 billion souls of Tertius Majoris collectively held their breath, awaiting the final, chilling calculation. It was to be the ultimate, impersonal determination of their worth in the stoic eyes of the angels of death, those superhuman warriors who had already reduced their individual lives to mere variables in complex, existential equations that even they, in their cold detachment, might not fully comprehend.